if you're a beginner to training and if you get DOMS for the first time, it can be pretty easy to freak out about it, right? Because the way in which this very mild form of an injury manifests can be a little freaky if you're getting it for the first time. Especially bicep DOMS is very tricky to deal with. So what do you do to make sure that you do not get DOMS? Because what we have to understand is that if we do get DOMS, it is going to restrict our ability to maintain continuity in training, right? Which is something that you definitely do not want happening as a beginner, right? Because it messes up with your continuity and your ability to be consistent in a couple of ways. First of all, mechanically, physically, you will be able to produce any kind of an output because the joint is going to be compromised. Just like in the case of bicep DOMS, you will not be able to really extend the arm fully without pain, so you can really forget about doing anything that involves extending the arm. This could mean anything from doing presses to curls, where you're curling the arm, all of these exercises, right? Different kinds of presses, different kinds of tricep extensions, bicep curls and whatnot, upper body movements, lifting weights. Doing a lot of things is going to be very difficult if you have DOMS, right? And then if you are a beginner that's suffering through DOMS, it messes up with your mental game as well, right? It puts you in a bad mental place. I remember training with a friend of mine lots of years ago when I was not doing this professionally. It was just me and my friend doing a workout, and we did a pretty heavy volume arms workout, right? And by that time, I had gotten DOMS a few times, but this friend of mine was suffering through it for the first time, and he was almost convinced that he had broken something or tore a muscle in his arm, and it was a pretty freaky incident. Freaked all of us out, and we had to do a lot to reassure him that nothing was wrong, and all he had to do was wait for a little while to let it subside, and it would be all okay. And I'm very sure that a lot of you are going to be able to relate with this. DOMS are pretty tricky to deal with, especially if it's happening with you for the first time. How do you deal with bicep DOMS? So it's kind of understood that if the eccentric load, right, when a muscle is lengthening with load, or when it is yielding to load, in the case of a bicep curl, it will be when your arm is extending. If that kind of a loading is unfamiliar for you, if you're not accommodated to managing that kind of a load, that's a scenario that puts you in risk of getting DOMS, or delayed onset of muscle soreness, or basically damaging your muscle to a certain extent, bicep muscle to a certain extent. Now you got to understand that what you can do to make sure that you do not get DOMS is a couple of things. You can change the kind of resistance that you're using for that particular exercise. So you can switch out dumbbells or barbells, whatever you're lifting for your bicep curls, with bands. So instead of doing the bicep curls or barbells with barbells or dumbbells, you can do it with a light pair of resistance bands. So what that helps you do is it changes the strength curve of the exercise. What is a strength curve? A strength curve basically just means that whenever you're doing an exercise, there's a certain range of motion, right, that the joint goes through. For example, in case of a bicep curl, you go from curling your elbow to extending your elbow. So this is the range of motion of this exercise. Right now, depending on the kind of resistance that you're working with, this exercise is going to have different levels of difficulty and different kind of a loading in different phases of this range of motion, just because of the kind of leverage that the bicep muscle has over the arm, right? So just as an example, doing a bicep curl is much easier when your arm is pretty close to flexion as opposed to when it is close to extension, right? So when you're extending, as your arm extends with load, and as you go to this part of range of motion for the bicep curl, this is where the exercise is typically tough, right? Just because of the kind of leverage that the bicep muscle has over your arm. And it is going to be very easy when you are curling, when you're in this phase of range of motion for a bicep curl, right? When you're pretty close to flexion. So extension, ranges that are close to extension are difficult than ranges when you're in the ranges close to flexion in a bicep curl, right? this can be changed, and this I'm talking about when you're lifting barbells or dumbbells, right? The exercise becomes relatively tough when you're close to extension, and it becomes relatively easy when you're close to flexion. You can just simply go and try this out. Lift any object, lift a pair of dumbbells, lift a barbell, and see, it's going to feel relatively easy when you're close to flexion, and it's going to feel very hard when you're close to extension. That's the strength curve of this particular exercise. You can simply change this by using resistance bands, because what resistance bands, and because of the kind of resistance that those bands provide, right, it provides you elastic resistance, right? And in the case of elastic resistance, and whenever you're dealing with resistance band, what happens is that the resistance of that object of the band is going to increase as the deformation of the band increases, which just simply means if you stretch the band out more, it's going to give you much more resistance than if the band is not stretched out and it is close to its resting length, right? So let's say if you're doing a bicep curl with the band, you start with your arm extended, right? This is when the band is very close to or exactly at its resting length, and this is when the resistance is minimum. So, and as you start curling the band up, the band extends, it deforms, right? It changes its length because it's elastic, and as it changes its length, the resistance that it provides increases. So in this case, what you're successfully able to do is, as your arm extends, in case of doing a bicep curl with a dumbbell or barbell, when your arm is extending, that would have been the difficult part of the exercise, right? But in case of a resistance band, when your arm is extending, this becomes the easy part of the exercise. So eccentric load for the loading or resistance for the eccentric portion of this exercise, or for the portion of this exercise where your arm is extending, decreases, right? So you're successfully able to deload the eccentric portion of the lift, and the resistance increases where you are stronger, right? In the part of the range of motion where you are stronger. So you're stronger when your arm is close to flexion, and this is where you're experiencing the most resistance that you're getting from a resistance band, and it's going to decrease as your arm extends and goes into the eccentric portion of the lift or the movement. So a simple way to make sure that you can make these bicep curls easier for yourself, especially as a beginner, and to make sure that you do not put yourself in a position where you stand the risk of developing DOMS, is to switch out the kind of resistance that you're lifting, right? Instead of picking barbells and dumbbells that typically make the eccentric portion of the lift difficult, do it with the resistance band, because it's going to deload the eccentric portion of the lift, and it is going to increase the resistance in the portion of the range of motion where you're stronger, where you have more leverage in the bicep, right? Another way that you can ensure that you do not develop DOMS is that simply do not train close to failure. That's a mistake that I personally made, that I can point to. If you're a beginner, if you're doing bicep curls for the first time, and this can be applied to other kinds of exercises as well, this concept of not training close to failure when you're just starting out. When you're just starting out, you can just train at a low to moderate effort, and you can make it about developing work capacity instead of exhausting that muscle to the point of failure, which puts you at a greater risk of developing DOMS or damaging your muscle fibers more than you would if you were just simply training at a less effort, moderate effort, and focusing on doing it for prolonged periods of time. So a simple format would be, let's say a typical exercise is a typical bicep arm session. Go for let's say a seasoned lifter goes like doing a set of exercise like whatever rep range you're doing, they do reps close to failure. If you're trying to grow a muscle, that's what you do, right? You want to highly stimulate and activate that muscle, right? Really activate that muscle, and that just simply means working it to the point of exhaustion. That's a good way to grow the muscles, but that's probably not what you want to be doing when you're just starting out. When you're just starting out, you can simply work at, pick lesser loads that allows you to work at a moderate or a very light effort, and make it about doing it for a prolonged period of time, which can simply mean maybe doing sets of 30 seconds or 1 minute with a very light or moderate pair of dumbbells or barbell or resistance bands like we talked about, and doing 3-4 sets like that, or 2-3 sets like that, whatever moderate or low effort means for you, right? What you have to keep in mind is you're not training to the point of exhaustion. You're just training at a low to moderate effort, and making it about just getting the work in at that point when you're a beginner, when you're just starting out. As the weeks go by, you can slowly focus on increasing the amount of work that you're doing at this low and moderate intensity. And then once you have built that work capacity, where workouts like these are not exhausting or tiring your muscles out to a point where you're developing soreness from them, or like excruciating soreness from these exercises, then maybe you can start thinking about working to the point of failure or working close to failure, which is what is going to get you closer to your objective of growing the muscle, right? So these are a couple of simple ways that you can do, that you can apply in your training, especially if you're a beginner, to make sure that you do not put yourself in a place where you're risking the chances of DOMS, or delayed onset of muscle soreness, which just simply means excruciating soreness that restricts a lot of the movements that you want to be doing in training. As a beginner, you want to be training frequently, right? Frequency matters. Consistency matters, being regular matters. That's what is going to get you ahead more than anything else when you're starting out, right? More than intensity of training. And if you get DOMS, all of this is going to be impeded. So these are a couple of simple solutions that you can apply in your training, and maybe that's going to help you maintain consistency, which is what matters if you want to be aiming for some long-term goals. I hope that makes sense. I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I'll see you guys for the next one.